I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Daniel Fink. Dr. Fink is a board-certified internist who developed tinnitus and hyperacusis after a one-time exposure to loud noise at a New Year's Eve dinner at a restaurant. Since becoming a noise activist, he has presented papers at national and international noise meetings, published articles based on these presentations, and after publication of an editorial on the safe noise level in the January 2017 issue of the American Journal of Public Health, he was asked to serve as an expert consultant to the World Health Organization on its Make Listening Safe program. Today, Dr. Fink will be speaking about the need to revise the NIOSH recommended exposure limit for noise downwards to prevent both occupational and non-occupational noise-induced hearing loss. At this time, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Fink.
Thank you, Kevin, for inviting me to speak. Thank you to all who are listening. This is the title of my presentation, and there's my email address, and feel free to send any questions along. Next slide, please, Kevin. This was presented initially at the 183rd meeting of the Acoustical Society of America in Nashville, Tennessee in December, almost 2 years ago now. And I published that in Proceedings of Meetings on Acoustics in red. I've taken the liberty of listing 3 of my other publications. My editorial in the American Journal of Public Health has been cited, I think, 97 times. The article about the safe noise exposure level was not in Nature, it's in the Nature publication, but the publication is the Journal of Exposure Science and Environmental Epidemiology, and that was in April of this year. And my new definition of noise is unwanted and or harmful sound, has been cited just under 50 times, opens the revised American Public Health Association policy statement on noise as a public health hazard, and was adopted for international use last year by the International Commission on Biological Effects of Noise. Next slide, please. I have 5 main points. The first, as the NIOSH recommended exposure limit, REL, I'll call it, of 85 dBA was published in 1972, updated in 1998. In both publications, it was assumed that workers had quiet when not at work. This is not explicitly stated in either edition of the NIOSH noise criteria, but it was mentioned in another publication and a NIOSH science blog in 2016. Multiple studies, some of which I'll refer to, document that workers and everyone else no longer have quiet when we're not at work, and therefore, for other reasons as well, but just for the fact that we have noise exposure when not at work, the NIOSH recommended exposure limit has to be revised downward to reflect workers' total noise dose to prevent occupational hearing loss. And I have to say that my interest is not in workplace or occupational noise exposure, for the main reason that workers have NIOSH recommendations, OSHA permissible exposure limits, and the workers' comp system, and the public has none. So why did I become interested in the occupational noise exposure level? Because it's often cited as safe for the public. And that's the 6th point on this slide, that the NIOSH REL does not prevent noise-induced hearing loss in workers. It certainly can't be safe for the public. And the 2nd bullet point is the direct quote from the NIOSH noise criteria monograph, page V in the page 5 in the forward. And the OSHA permissible exposure limit allows a 25% excess risk of developing occupational noise-induced hearing loss during a 40-year lifetime. That's a direct quote, but it's really during a 40-year working history exposure. Next slide, please. Let me just sidetrack to talk about acceptable risk. As the previous slide showed, the NIOSH REL 85 dBA allows an 8% increased risk of material hearing loss from occupational noise exposure. What is acceptable risk? Is a good question. The World Health Organization considered this in a book about water quality, but the article was actually published in an IEE journal, Electrical Engineering Journal. And basically, acceptable risk for a member of the public is in a range of 1 to 10,000 to probably 1 in a million. Next slide. In case there's anyone who's interested or knowledgeable about the Occupational Safety Act, people will say, well, NIOSH and OSHA can only deal with occupational exposures, not with non-occupational exposures. But my reading of the law is that the Occupational Safety and Health Act is mandated to provide medical criteria that will ensure that no employee suffers diminished health, functional capacity, or life expectancy as a result of his and those years' work experience. And what's different about noise compared to other occupational exposures, and we'll consider lead, we'll consider ionizing radiation, we can consider toxic solvents like toluene. Noise is the only only occupational exposure I can think of, except for lead. If someone is a stained glass hobbyist, he or she has lead exposure, but otherwise the rest of us don't have lead exposure unless we're remodeling an old house with lead paint in the windowsills. So therefore, I think non-occupational noise exposure has to be considered by NIOSH. Next slide, please. Just a reminder, we evolved in quiet. This is from the National Park Service. We're not used to loud noise. We've developed very few mechanisms to protect the ear against loud noise. The little tiny muscles in the inner ear are among them, but that's about it. Next slide, please. This is what noise does to the cochlear hair cells. It damages them and destroys them. Occupational noise exposure causes hearing loss. This has been known for centuries. As Kevin mentioned, healthcare should not be a noisy occupation. He and I had a discussion on the phone, and there is no exemption in the law, as far as I know, or the regulations about theoretically quiet occupations. I think the only industry that's exempt from NIOSH and OSHA that has its own set of regulations is mining for historical reasons. But anyway, I agree with Kevin, the healthcare should not be a noisy occupation. Next slide, please. The equal energy hypothesis is a hypothesis stating that equal amounts of sound energy produce equal amounts of hearing impairment, regardless of how the sound energy is distributed over time. But this may not be true for impulsive noise like that in an MRI, for example. And there's some evidence, both from NIOSH and then an article by Alice Suter in 2017, that hearing impairment caused by impulsive noise, which is very short noise durations, but of very high intensity, may be greater than predicted. I would note that as best I can tell, and I actually asked one of the world's experts this question, as best I can tell, there are no studies of impulsive noise in the public. There are very few actually in the occupational setting, except for there's a body of work for the military on gunshot noise. I would note that noise exposure in both occupational and non-occupational but everyday life settings is a combination of lower ambient sound pressure levels combined with intermittent higher levels, and those include impulse noise exposure. Next slide, please. As I said in my introduction, NIOSH assumes that workers have quiet when not at work, and the quote above with the bolding is from the NIOSH Science blog post about the difference between occupational and public noise exposure recommendations or guidelines published in 2016. Next slide, please. And this is from the EPA noise levels monograph, but this is not from NIOSH. This is from the EPA calculated in 1974. Again, no more than 60 dB when not at work. Next slide. And this shows NIOSH and OSHA talk about noise dose, and 85 dBA is the 8-hour 100% permissible noise dose or recommended noise dose from NIOSH. Next slide, please. Until relatively recently, non-occupational noise exposure was very rare. If one was a hunter, if you played the drums in your garage band or did woodworking with power tools, historically, that was really the only non-occupational noise exposure, but this began to change in the 1950s and 60s between new technology, expansion of the middle class that allowed sound to be amplified without distortion, power tools, home stereo systems, Anyone with gray hair might remember when they would advertise, 60 watts of power in the home stereo system, then 100 watts of power. There was better, louder amplification of cultural and sports events without distortion, better, louder amplification restaurants, bars, and parties, and more recently, personal audio systems, which we won't talk about anymore. Next slide, please, slide 17. This was actually first noted in 1966 in the New England Journal, again in bold. What has passed unnoticed is that many noise levels encountered in the community exceed standards found in juries and industry. Next slide. The major sources of non-occupational noise exposure, I wrote about this, presented it at 2021 ASA meeting. That was a Zoom meeting only due to the COVID pandemic, and published this. Personal audio systems, transit noise, leisure noise, household appliances, power tools, and landscape maintenance equipment. Next slide, please. And noise exposure in everyday life has been studied using a variety of measures. Flamme or Flammy, I've heard the name pronounced both times. I've never met him. Gave people dosimeters and found the average daily noise levels were 79 dB in men and 77 in women. That was an 8-hour equivalent. Neitzel in New York City, where a lot of people take transit, estimated that 90% of, and this was based, I think, on sampling and then extrapolated, 90% of New York City transit users, 80%, 7% of non-users exceeded the recommended 70 dB limit. Rick, who's an industrial hygienist and professor at University of Michigan, made a common mistake. He wrongly cited the EPA 70 decibel safe noise limit as a recommendation. It is not. In the forward, EPA specifically says this is not a standard guideline or recommendation. Anyway, but it is the calculated safe noise limit, and the only calculated safe noise limit that I've been able to find. If anyone has a publication with a different calculated evidence-based or actually empiric safe noise limit, please send me that reference. I've not been able to find it in almost 10 years as a noise activist. And as Rick concluded there in the bold, this risk is driven primarily by exposures other than occupational noise. Next slide, please. In another study in Sweden, Neitzel reported that 88% of subjects, again, this was done using dosimetry, exceeded the weekly average safe noise dose, as did 84% of people in Spain, 85% in China. Mays noted that individuals received more than half of their weekly noise exposure from non-occupational sources, and Pinkowski also wrote about this in 2021. Next slide, please. And this is from the Apple hearing study. Rick Neitzel in Michigan is the principal investigator on that, and is between the iWatches and the iPhones. And the article was published to show the effect of COVID lockdowns reducing noise exposure 3 dB, which is about a 50% decrease in noise energy. But I liked it because the first half pre-lockdown shows that most people were getting more than the EPA calculated 70 dB safe noise level, although I just realized this is an 8-hour LEX and not a 24-hour LEX. So it's probably near 70, but in the sawtooth pattern is on weekends, it's on Saturdays. That's when most people get their biggest noise dose. Next slide, please. So there are 5 problems with the NIOSH REL. Again, the calculations assume workers are quiet when not at work, no longer true. NIOSH used 15 decibel hearing threshold level as an indicator of auditory damage, but true normal, Pinkowski wrote about this in a 2017 paper, is 0. Perhaps more importantly, NIOSH measured hearing loss by limited range pure tone audiometry, not by newer, more sensitive measures that would find auditory disorders much earlier at a much higher prevalence rate. NIOSH used only a 40-year work history, but we all, workers and members of the public, are exposed to noise 24/7, 365, as they say, from birth to death. And actually, hearing begins in the womb, and there are fascinating studies showing that crying babies respond better to soothing in their native language. And this was done between French babies and German babies. And then another reason is that the comparison population, people not exposed to occupational noise, undoubtedly included people exposed to noise in everyday life, what Kreider called socioacusis in the classic 1983 paper. Next slide, please. And again, the sixth problem that I mentioned earlier is that the NIOSH REL doesn't prevent noise-induced hearing loss in workers and certainly isn't safe for the public. Next slide, please. Again, this is a quote from the NIOSH noise criteria showing that they're using 15 decibel hearing threshold level at very limited frequencies. And again, as Piankowski wrote, normal is 0 hearing threshold level. And maybe normal includes a 10 decibel decrement at the highest frequencies. Next slide, please. Again, screening audiometry is an insensitive measure of auditory damage, and more sensitive measures might find greater damage earlier at a higher prevalence rate. And I'm convinced that noise-induced hearing loss in old age is caused by cumulative lifetime noise exposure. And I mentioned this on the previous slide. Next slide, please. And this is shown by these graphs from Lieberman et al. Towards a differential diagnosis of hearing loss in humans. And the high-risk students in red were music students, and the low-risk students were students in other disciplines, I think largely like communications or speech therapy at one of the Boston universities. Lieberman is director of the Eaton Peabody Laboratory at the Massachusetts Eye and Ear Infirmary, and he's a professor at Harvard Medical School. So you can see in graph A, standard audiometry doesn't show any statistically significant difference from 250 hertz to 8 kilohertz. But when you do extended range audiometry, you find auditory damage. And the music students were in general in their late teens, early 20s. All the subjects, in fact, were in general in their early 20s, I think. But in graph C, when people were just asked a simple question, do you have trouble understanding speech, listening in quiet, listening in noise, and localizing sound, you can see that there were significant differences listening in noise and differences that did not reach statistical significance for the high-risk subjects in the study. And again, in terms of what I'll call a hyperacusis question, the differences were found, again, despite going back to graph A, normal standard audiometry for both the subjects, high risk and low risk subjects. Next slide. I mentioned this already, that the comparison population undoubtedly included people with noise-induced hearing loss. And again, I'm convinced that hearing loss is not part of normal aging. That's a different discussion for a different time. But the appropriate comparison population for the occupational noise exposure studies would be a population not exposed to loud noise, which in general does not exist in any industrialized society in North America or in Western Europe. Next slide, please. Again, EPA calculated its 70 decibel safe noise level by adjusting the NIOSH recommended exposure limit for the additional time exposure. And finally, I was able to convince CDC to start citing 70 decibels instead of 85 dB or dBA. Next slide, please. And World Health also recommends, this is only for leisure noise, and this is for an entire year. I'm not that interested in the occupational noise exposure limits, but they form the basis for the recommendations for the public, both for the World Health Organization here and then for the ITU recommendations. They're really guidelines for safe listening devices and systems, again, derived from the occupational studies. Next slide. So again, these are my 5 main points: that the NIOSH recommended exposure limits are old. It's been 26 years. They should be updated. I've discussed this with NIOSH contacts. Ain't gonna happen. There are other fish to fry, and industry doesn't want any updating of these recommendations. Again, for both editions of the NIOSH noise criteria monograph, it was assumed that workers had quiet when not at work. Something, third bullet point, that is no longer true for both workers and everyone else. And therefore, just on the basis of simple mathematics, but also involving a redefinition of the hearing threshold level for occupational hearing loss, a use of more sensitive tests of auditory damage, etc., the NIOSH recommended exposure limit has to be revised downwards, which I would hope, since it forms the basis for recommendations for non-occupational noise exposure for the public, this recalculation would also have important implications for public health. When I first discussed this idea, I got pushback from people saying, well, but members of the public are exposed to continuous noise 85 dBA, 8 hours a day, 50 weeks a year for 40 years, which is the statutory occupational exposure for all occupational exposures. And my response is, well, something is causing noise-induced hearing loss, and that was as determined by CDC in a publication in 2017 in about a quarter of American adults aged 20 to 69, and more than half of the people with noise-induced hearing loss had no significant occupational exposure. So there has to be non-occupational noise exposure, and I think impulse noise probably plays a disproportionate role in both occupational and especially non-occupational hearing loss, whether it's pounding in one nail. I become much more protective of my hearing if I'm just pounding in one nail that used to cause momentary discomfort and maybe a few seconds of ringing or muffling of sound. I put in my earplugs to do that. If I'm using a power tool, I use dual protection earplugs and earmuff hearing protection. But I think if you're walking down the sidewalk in New York and the construction worker starts using a jackhammer, or you're standing down the corner and somebody guns a Harley around the corner and you sort of wince, that impulse noise has a disproportionate effect and may account for a greater percentage of hearing loss in both workers and in the public. In work, it could be a clanging of a metal piece of equipment on a metal shelf when you're putting it in the OR. You're putting it on the shelf to be sent back down to central supply for cleaning and sterilization. And you jump because somebody puts it down roughly. I think that kind of noise exposure really is very important. Okay, now we'll take questions, and just please show the acknowledgement and disclosure slide. I have no commercial relationships with anyone. I actually pay my own way. Being a noise activist costs me money, but I'm glad to do that. And I both stand on the shoulders of giants, as Pasteur, I think, was reputed to have said, but I certainly did not get here on my own. I had the help of a lot of people and the support of my family, especially my son Richard, for technical support. With that, I'll stop. You can close the slides, Kevin, and I'll turn on the video, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a very interesting and informative presentation.
Thank you. Dr. Fink, that was amazing. Thank you so much. I am curious about, in addition to hearing loss, some of the research that you might be familiar with some of the other physiological consequences of exposure to extra noise, like obesity from high cortisol levels, or stress, insomnia, depression, whatever. It's not just hearing loss. That amazing amount of noise that we are exposed to has so many effects on our body. I wonder if you can speak to some of the, in addition to hearing loss, problems that are a consequence of that noise in our environment.
You're absolutely right. Most doctors don't know, and certainly probably vanishingly small numbers of members of the public know, that noise has auditory and non-auditory health effects. The best two publications are actually both 10 years old. one from Matthias Bosner, who's now at the University of Pennsylvania in the Lancet, and one by Hammer et al. Rick Neitzel at Michigan was a senior author, both published in 2014. And when I came across it, I was amazed. And you're exactly right. Noise has non-auditory health effects mediated actually by three involuntary systems: the autonomic nervous system, which responds within seconds, if not milliseconds, causing increases in blood pressure and pulse; the hypophyseal pituitary adrenal axis, that responds within minutes to perhaps an hour or two, increasing the cortisol levels, which increases blood sugar and blood lipid levels; and then a third system, which was first described by Tawakol and colleagues at the Mass General in 2017, published in Lancet, that stress causes activation of the amygdala. That in turn causes inflammation of the vascular intima, the lining of the arteries, which in turn causes increased rates of cardiovascular disease and death. And that effect has specifically been shown in an article by Osborne to be caused by transportation noise. So noise has multiple non-auditory health effects. The CDC has published from NIOSH, actually a NIOSH publication, about increased cholesterol and increased blood pressure in workers exposed to occupational noise. So there are at least a handful of publications on that I'm aware of. But the main effect, I'm pretty sure, comes from noise pollution, and of that, unless you live near a factory or most of the noise pollution in the United States and in Europe as well comes from transportation noise. So those are all effects, and the central illustration in Munzel's 2018 paper in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology actually summarizes it as well as anything I've seen. So I apologize for not having that illustration on a slide for you, but thank you for asking that question.